I want to welcome you to today's session on the Ukraine. I think at one time that the Center for National Interest has really caught the news cycle. This is a perfect time, I think, to assess the developments and potential future events in Ukraine and the response of Russia, the United States, European Union, and others to the unfolding saga there. I want to welcome you all here, but in particular maybe welcome the three ambassadors that have joined us today from Germany, the Czech Republic, and Iceland. Denmark. Four. Oh, you were under my radar. Excuse me, Mr. Ambassador. But the rules will be very simple today. I'm going to ask our speaker, Andranik Migranyan, to take the lead. He's a man, especially those of you who know the center, needs very little introduction. He's now based in New York, and he is the director of the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation. Prior to that, he served in several advisory, high-level advisory positions in the Russian government, and continues to be, I think, an unofficial advisor of sorts to the Kremlin. And I'll ask him to speak for 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'll call on Paula Dobriansky, who will make her remarks. She, of course, has served in a variety of high-level governmental positions. I think most recently as Undersecretary of State. I think following her tenure in government, she was a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, and she is a fellow member of the Executive Committee of the Atlantic Council with me. Welcome, Paula. So, Andranik, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. With Rick, we started talks about Ukraine in Houston. That was in August, September?
Yeah, August or September.
Something like that, which means we talked a lot, and I'm going to continue. I would like, because I'm very limited in my time, and unfortunately, I'm not used to limit myself, but I have to. That's why the theme is huge, enormous, but I'll try to be as short and raise the questions which I think are interesting here, at least, and I think some raised questions in American media and American political community need to be answered, might be. In my presentation, I'll try to do that as well as possible, but I hope that during questions and answers, I will go later on and in details discussing of every issue. First, I would like to say that there is an illusion in the West or widely circulated falsification that in Russia nobody really considered that Ukraine is an independent country. That is absolute falsification, because never ever any Russian politician on the highest level or on any level considered Ukraine as non-independent country. But what is reality, and we are witnessing, this is the thing which usually in Russian we have a very good definition of what is Ukraine as a state, but in English I didn't have the exact term, but yesterday Robert Segal on NPR helped me to find the exact term. In Russian it's called Украина, все эксперты считали, несостоявшееся еще государство. Some people Ariel Cohen, some others offered me the term unaccomplished, not accomplished, but David Segal said it's not incomplete. Is it the right translation, Dmitry? Not incomplete, which is a reality. By the way, we wrote about that many, many times. And in this sense, Ukraine is very fragile, and it's very, very, strange institutionally formed entity. And now it's a commonplace, even in Western media, that this country is, and this nation is, deeply divided through ethnic lines, through regional lines, through linguistic lines, through religious lines. In every sense, the country and nation is divided, not integrated, and practically some are going even further, telling that in Ukraine there is two nations, two states, two countries. Every crisis proves that. But this demanded one important thing on behalf of Ukrainian politicians, to be very cautious. And up to a certain point, Ukrainian politicians were very cautious. Like I know all these presidents of Ukraine personally. I know Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yanukovych, Yushchenko. I met with all these people, and some I know much better, the others not that much. Some even were coming to my hotel room as candidates of presidents, which means that I am talking as first-hand insider, especially in the 90s when, on behalf of President Yeltsin and his administration, I was going back and forth and having my contacts with the people. What kept Ukraine still integrated? From the east, people came to power, like Kravchuk and then Kuchma, opposing to the people from the west, taking Eastern demands and Eastern slogans, coming to Kiev, realizing that if they are going to push too hard, they are going to split the country. That's why they had to move to the west in order to keep the integrity of the country. And in all these years, until the end of Kuchma's government, there was a slow drift, though formally it was considered that Westerners are in power, pro-Russians are in power, but in reality, none of them was really, as some people very stupidly is considering that Ukrainian leaders from the East were Moscow's puppets. If somebody is thinking that, it's just the fantasies and poor imagination of people, because less reliable, less, normal, predictable partners than these people who came to power, Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yanukovych, you can find. That's why in 2004-2005, when Yushchenko won the elections, I was the only one in Russia who in Rossiyskaya Gazeta, this is a governmental newspaper, published an article that victory of Yushchenko is victory of Russia, because Kuchmism is the most terrible thing which we have as Russians in Ukraine. We need to have an open, clear, understandable, and predictable enemy rather than unreliable, some idiots who are constantly lying and lying and lying and doing, nobody knows what they are doing. That's why even this article was called «Коктейль победы, апельсиновый сок с русской водкой» или «Почему Россия выиграла украинские выборы». Orange juice and Russian vodka, or why Russia won presidential elections. What by
Yushchenko's victory
was
the victory for
victory for Russia. Exactly. What happened after Yushchenko's victory? All these people who came to power, they started fight each other to show the ugly face of Maidan and Orange Revolution. They were, blaming each other that they are thieves, they are corrupted people. Of course they were. and everybody knows that. And that's why they were just killing each other, fighting each other. And practically they discredited themselves at that level that former criminal who twice was in prison, Yanukovych, triumphantly won other next elections. But again, this was not a Moscow's puppet. I would like to mention only several cases when Russia could really intervene. Another thing is that Russia is intervening or meddling Ukrainian affairs. As though Russian politicians in Supreme Soviet and State Duma raised many times the problems of intervening into Ukrainian affairs. Even many analytical were works proposing how Ukraine could be partitioned between East and West and South, how it's possible to take Crimea, how it's possible to do all different kind of things to stimulate the collapse of this very fragile, country. Never, ever Russian authorities did this kind of adventurism. First, it started with the first statement made Vashanov, that was press secretary of Yeltsin after the collapse of Soviet Union, right in 1991. He said, Ukraine, independent Ukraine, in these borders, where is Novorossiya and Crimea? He was sacked. In 92, 93, Supreme Soviet was discussing returning back Crimea to Russia. If there was some problems concerning legitimacy of transfer of Crimea to Ukraine on behalf of Khrushchev as a gift, but there was very serious legal foundations to return back Sevastopol, because Sevastopol under Soviet constitution was the city which was subordinated to Moscow directly. It was not a city which was subordinated to even Russian authorities. And in transfer of Crimea to Ukraine, nothing was said about Sevastopol. But of course, there were another legal foundation for Ukrainian part. They were telling us, but after that, we were putting Sevastopol in our constitution, and Russia didn't put that in its constitution. But anyway, in spite of the decision to step in and to take back Sevastopol and Crimea, Yeltsin said no. And in 94, in Crimea, Russian party took power and passed the resolution that Crimea is uniting with Russia. Yeltsin said no. Russian authorities never ever made any attempt to destabilize Ukraine and to destroy this country. And now, it's a...
One more minute.
Yeah, but, okay.
You'll get another chance.
How American diplomacy is heavy-handed.
Okay. Now, in short, what happened now? Of course, might be this was not only goodwill of Yeltsin, but the situation of Russia. Yeltsin was hanging around asking for support, political and financial, in Washington, in Brussels, in many other places. Russia was in shambles, institutions were very weak. Now Russia is completely different. Russia is very consolidated. Russia feels itself very confident, and Russia has another leader. And in this sense, not Russia is meddling, but what happened practically, the first stage of this Ukrainian revolution, and we can call this a revolution, in Western Ukraine, Banderists, radicals, nationalists, they were grabbing police stations and grabbing the armament. They were using arms. They were seizing the official buildings of regional, governments, which means revolution started in the West. And the West practically, using the words of Yanukovych, organized this coup, and under the pressure of these people, Kiev is trying to put in order the city and might be the country. Which means what they did from point of view of some Russian analysts. I'm not talking on behalf of government, but very soon might be Russian government's position will be formulated by Putin because he is still taking the pose. The problem is that not Russia, but because of these radicals, there is no legitimate power now in Kiev. And as a result, in Crimea and in the East, they said that we don't accept the decisions of Kiev because Kiev has no power over them. And in this sense, might be the Yanukovych's resignation is good and bad for the West and for the East. In short run for the West, in long run for the East. Because until Yanukovych was there, he was practically paralyzing the activities for self-organization in South and in the East. Now South and East are free from Kiev. This is the most important thing which happened. Even one, confirmation that Russia didn't do anything in order to destabilize the country, didn't use its opportunities to strengthen real Russian forces in the East, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Kharkov, in Lugansk, in other places. That's why, by the way, though they declare that they don't recognize the coup, they don't recognize these authorities in Kiev, but now they are, very reluctant. They are not aware, and they thought that Russia must come and directly intervene. But this is not the case, and Russia is not going to do that. But what Russia is going to do, and I would like to be very clear on this. When Susan Rice is telling on Sunday on some of the programs that Russia's interference will be a grave mistake, it could be laughable in Moscow for many analysts and politicians. Because when Senator McCain and many Americans are asking or demanding Obama to bombard Syria, to go to Libya, to go to other places, far, far away from America. And as I told yesterday to NPR, 99% of Americans they can't show on the map these countries. Ukraine is an existential problem for Russia. Tens of millions of Russians over there, half of the population Russian speakers, and millions have relatives in Russia and vice versa. And if from the West, the people armed are going to go to Crimea or to other places, use the force and try to impose on them their vision of Ukraine, this is my opinion. I'm not sure that Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol could stay out, and I'm not sure that Russia could stay out. What's gonna happen if this kind of clashes started over there? Because it's not far away from Russia, it's next door. It's Russia's backyard. And I would like to finish here. If this kind of thing happened in Crimea, and Crimea is ready to repeal every kind of attack, and if Crimea declared its independence or something else, nobody knows what's going to happen. And after that, by the way, there is application for eastern part of the governors and the people of eastern Ukraine to Putin and to Russia to come and to support. And there is unanimous position of Russian elite, Russian political forces, and Russian society that Russia has to interfere in case if the lives of Russians will be in danger. And this is the exact situation. Thank God we have a sober president, he is not drinking. We have a sportsman and the man who is very responsible. And I hope that his decisions will be adequate decisions. Now, it depends how Western Ukraine and Westerners in Washington and Brussels and Berlin are going to act.
So we're going to call on Paula to talk about these Westerners, specifically in Washington. Paula, you have the floor. Thank you, Andranik.
And I get a few extra minutes. First, let me thank the center. Oh, yeah, that's right, the microphone. First, let me thank the center for holding today's discussion. It certainly is one that's playing out, and I think that the balance on part of all parties and engagement on all parties really needs to be very thoughtful and constructive. I want to make 5 points. And let me begin with, and I look around the room, and there are so many veterans of these issues and knowledgeable people in this part of the world, about this part of the world, that I feel a little bit silly starting with this, but I felt I had to. We were talking up front here about the morning programs, and one thing that struck me on the morning programs, that particularly from a number of pundits, they were talking about why this area isn't in the interest of the United States, by the way. I don't know if you saw that. So let me start with that. Why does Ukraine matter, not only to the United States, but to Europe as a whole? Clearly, it's a country of 46 million people. It spans Europe and Asia. Its geopolitical significance is key because of it being at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It's the size of France, and we know that if Ukraine plummets economically, it's going to have ramifications for everyone, not just Ukraine, Europe, Russia, the United States. So in that sense, I think that the issue of Ukraine matters. We all have a great stake in this. Let me go to the second, and that is, it might be worth going back and just putting in context what we're witnessing play out now, and remind ourselves, how and why did this happen? The fact is, the reason why it happened was because of that very last minute, and I say last minute, decision made by Yanukovych not to go forward in the Vilnius summit with an association with the European Union. Now, to me, when that happened, there were two elements that really fostered the kind of protests that took place. And by the way, at that time, there were in literally 21 of, if you will, the provinces, 21 protests, not just concentrated in Kiev. And this is out of some 27 provinces at that time. And by the way, now it's all except really Crimea. Crimea is in a little bit of a different direction, and Lugansk, and of course that's where you have a sizable Russian concentration. But let me go back. The two factors were, one, there was an expectation with the president who, when he was elected, Yanukovych, one of his first pronouncements was, we're going to have an association with the EU, and I believe his first visit was in fact to Brussels. And literally stating that this was in Ukraine's interest because economically there needed to be reforms from within. So I think there were many expectations this was the path that it was on. But there was a second factor that brought out these protesters, because the protesters were protesting by the fact that this was abrogated and there was no desire to look in other directions or to have Ukraine's arm twisted from the east economically by the threat and the imposition of sanctions in the energy area and in the agricultural area, which were tangible elements which were not constructive at this time with Ukraine. So the second element was the element outright of corruption. Many of the protesters came out and they were protesting not just only because of the failure of the Vilnius summit, but also because of corruption. It might be also worth noting that there were a number of polls taken during this time. And there have been a number of analysts who've written about these polls. And when Ukrainians have been polled in terms of, which direction and do you want to have either, an association with the European Union, you have some 44% to some 30% in one poll, 20% undecided, to another poll where you have some 60% want to go for an association with the European Union and some 40% not. My reason for citing that is because also a number of these polls showed, an inclination and manifestation of what direction Ukrainians want to go to, and regardless of whether they're located in the east or the west. And let me just mention on the second point, and I'll go to the third, there is another, I think, also critical factor here, and that is, I think we need to be reminded of, Ukraine has had many evolutions in its history, and so has the region. we need to remind ourselves that we're also dealing with really a new generation. And I would also subscribe that that's an element that really has, in my opinion, also changed in many ways some of the tone and the tenor of what's being played out. I think there's a real desire to clean up, a real desire to have corruption rid of, and a Ukrainian official just told me the other day that for the first time, actually, this person said, you know, I think actually Ukrainians are ready to actually undertake the kinds of measures that would be very painful for them economically because they realize they have no recourse. They have to go forward this way. So let me go to the third. The third is about just the U.S. I would say, in a nutshell, I would have liked to have seen the United States engage with Europe earlier in this. I think the U.S. Came a little bit late to the table. I think that if we had engaged well before last year and really engaged the Ukrainians in a discussion of the kinds of steps that needed to be taken, plus the kind of package, plus some of the sensitive issues that existed there, I actually think that maybe it wouldn't have turned out the way that it did. In other words, there could have been potentially a successful Vilnius summit. Why do I say that? I look back during my tenure as undersecretary, I lived through the time of 2004 with Kuchma, and where there was a lot of pressure coming from the East in terms of those flawed elections and what he needed to do or not do. And there was a great deal of pressure on Ukraine. And you know, in the end, my colleague Andranik, gave a portrayal of Yushchenko. And during that period, I have to say there were a lot of developments that were for the good for Ukraine. Ukraine has a ways to go. But I will say this, back to the point about Kuchma, it took a lot of leadership. A man from Dnipropetrovsk to actually recall those elections, have the legal council renounce them, and go forward with new elections. And then, yes, Yushchenko won. I didn't see that as a victory, by the way, for anyone except for Ukrainians. Why? I've been an election observer in Ukraine, and I have to say I saw a process unfold here that was favorable. Back to the U.S. and the EU. So I would have liked to have seen engagement earlier. One of the criticisms that has been out there is that some of the discussions were a bit too technical, rather than taking it on a higher plane and looking at some of the broader issues. That's, I'm sharing at least some of the points I've heard. Personally, I think that coming to fast forward, I think that the Obama administration handled, in terms of crisis management, has handled the situation last year well up to the present time, and especially this recent mission of the German foreign minister, the French, and the Polish foreign minister, all three going, I think was really extremely positive engagement and difficult engagement in trying to move Ukraine forward and to try to attempt to bring some stability. Let me go to my fourth point, and that's Russia. With regard to Russia, I would have liked to have seen both the US and also Europe actually call Russia a bit more on some of the steps that it took last year in terms of the, as I said, not only the threats, but the sanctions that were imposed on Ukraine. Ukraine, it's the biggest issue is how it advances economically. So you want to actually take steps, if you want to be constructive, to move it forward rather than to move it backwards. And in this case, I don't think that was helpful. But what I think was problematic, they weren't called on it. Russia is a member of the WTO. It's part of the G8. There are rules and guidelines. When you come into that community, there's an expectation of how you engage and how you act. And in that sense, I felt that that was a disappointment. One of the things that Russia does underscore a lot is the issue of the Westphalia Treaty, rule of law, sovereignty. Many of these points are enunciated. And these are points that clearly come into play here. So come to the last basket. And the last basket, and I will close, and that is, what's the way forward? I think that here, given the diplomatic initiative undertaken by the 3 European foreign ministers and with the engagement of Ambassador Lukin, by the way, who was there on the scene during that time.
He didn't sign anything.
No, that's true. He didn't sign anything,
He
but
was a
I
symbolic
mentioned that he
figure
was
over there.
there for the
Fig leaf.
discourse. What direction he chose to take is a different story and underscores my point about the importance of taking constructive steps here. But it points to the fact that there's engagement of all stakeholders in this, and that there should be. In terms of the way forward, I think that it's essential that the United States and the EU, working in tandem, I think really provide the kind of support that's needed at this time for Ukraine. The first being its economy. Its economy is on the verge of literally a dire, it's already a dire crisis, but absolute bankruptcy. And so that is absolutely essential. I understand, I believe the Obama administration has mentioned already a pledge for aid and assistance, and I believe also the European Union. Secondly, I think it's very important during this period that Ukraine and all of these opposition parties maintain unity. It's in their own interest. I think they have a common goal, and I think it's critical that they maintain that unity. One footnote here, and I'd have to differ from my colleague on this issue about, this issue of divisions. I remember actually our National Intelligence Council, and some of you may remember this, when Ukraine became independent, had predicted back at the time of its independence that Ukraine was going to split immediately. It hasn't. And quite frankly, I think that, and I've even heard that some of the governors, if you will, or leaders in the East are already talking about their running for president in the upcoming elections. So, what does that tell you in this case? I don't see that as something that's imminent, but I do think that it's critical that we work together, all of us, to advance this. My last couple of points, I think it's important that Ukraine undertake its reforms, political, economic reforms, and finally, with regard to Russia's role in this, I would put forth the prognosis that I think this is an opportunity, actually, for Russia. Russia has interests, and I don't think anyone in this room would deny that Russia doesn't have interests. But the question is, what rights does it have in terms of how it engages? And in that regard, I think it's in Russia's own interest, especially economically. It wants stability in the area, if it wants stability. This is an opportunity for Russia to play, I think, actually a significant leadership role in being part of a solution and not part of a problem. I'll end there.
Thank you, Paula. There are a number of questions that occur to me, and I'll ask one or two of them to get the ball rolling. Trying to be an analyst listening to these two presentations, there seems to be maybe a difference here on a basic assumption, and that seems to be whether or not, under current circumstances, Ukraine is going to be able to hang together. Reading between the lines, Andranik, I got the impression from you that given both where you started and where you ended, the cleavages, the history, the cultural differences are just too great, and that you see some fairly important changes on the horizon. And Paula, listening to you, I heard just the opposite. The requirement, the steps that the Ukrainians have taken in the past, and despite the differences, the desire of most Ukrainians and those outside Ukraine to maintain its territorial integrity. Can you both briefly address that issue?
I think it's for sure that Ukraine is deeply divided, and what is important and what is Russia's perception, that in Ukraine, in ideological sphere, in mass media, in cultural sphere, in language sphere, from Western regions, the extreme nationalists took the power and control over all these areas, even under Kravchuk and Kuchma, and they are practically trying to grow up and to educate youngsters in hatred towards Russia. This is Russia's perception. And it is going on forceful Ukrainization of Russians, in which Soviet Union and Russia was criticized during Soviet period in forceful Russification in these regions. As a result, Russia doesn't want to have on its borders the population feeling hatred and being radically antagonistic and blaming Russia in all their problems. This is not Russia's goal. That's why, and the country is split, and if these nationalists are going to push forward this process, from Russia we see that there's going to have a resistance in Ukraine, and Russia can't stay away. This is the reality.
I'd make...
Russia, as I said, is absolutely constructive, never ever attempted to intervene, to interfere. Even simple thing I proposed in '94 during elections of Kuchma to Crimean president and to Supreme Soviet, who were all my friends. I said, listen, Kuchma promised to sign with you a special treaty like Yeltsin signed with Shaimeyev in accordance the same treaty with Tatarstan, because Tatarstan just refused to participate in Russian elections in 1993. We don't want. We want a special status. Don't participate in elections. Even this turned down President Yeltsin. He turned down even my offer, Admiral Kasatonov, to run for president as Crimea, the chief of Black Sea Fleet. Nobody wanted to intervene. But this is a completely different situation, because West is trying to impose its views, its vision, its understanding of the future of Ukraine. Their vision is not accepted for a large part of Ukrainian population. This is the core of the problem. And by the way, Russia didn't oppose Yanukovych's going to Vilnius. Absolutely. But when Yanukovych was bargaining, what Yanukovych was offered by EU? Some miserable 600 million euros. And in a case when he needed from 15, and now yesterday I saw on one of these programs 35 billion they need, and the economy is in total collapse. That's why they decided we are going there, signing, and country is in collapse, and we will be kicked out. They were kicked out in any way.
A couple of points on the issue as to why I don't see that happening. First is because, as I mentioned, and I remember it quite well when Ukraine became independent, that actually our own analysts were speculating that there could be this kind of development. I think a distinction needs to be made here, and that is, as in any society, and when you have different ethnicities, you can have some kinds of tensions. And I actually think that Ukraine has more or less fathomed through in dealing with some differences in terms of its internal, if you will, ethnic fabric. Having said that, I think most significantly the facts speak for themselves. When you look at, even right now, the demonstrations, I am struck by the fact that there has been no one who has reached out or asked for Eastern assistance or engagement, interference. I'll use it that way. There was even a debate in Crimea just recently where the Speaker of the Parliament there did make an appeal, but was countermanded, by the way, by the Crimean deputy minister. So, you know, I think the fact is that you have Ukrainians who are desirous of trying to move forward, figure out ways forward. And this raises a crucial policy point. In the time ahead there, all of the parties need to be represented. You need to have both East, West, Middle represented at the table, so all of these concerns in this time of transition and a transitional government are taken into account. I want to just add two other points. On the issue about interference, I come back to the point, well, Yanukovych going to Vilnius and wasn't being prevented by Moscow. Well, the fact is though what was hanging over Yanukovych's head were these threats and sanctions, economic sanctions. So one didn't have to be prevented from attending a meeting to know what the realities were and the kind of strong-arming that was going on. That was not favorable. But lastly, and I think importantly here, when you step back and look at what are the options here, if Ukraine has an association with the European Union, by the way, there are no tariff barriers. And by the way, those no tariff barriers would really make a difference in terms of ultimately Ukraine's exports into new markets. In the case with the customs union and not just, okay, aid that was offered from Moscow, aid offered as a Band-Aid. You have to make changes. And in this case with the customs union, I think most graphically, by the way, you do have tariff barriers. And there are also other kinds of parameters that exist, which would also be conflictive with WTO requirements of which Ukraine is a part.
Thank you for...
Rick,
no,
5
no,
seconds.
no, no, no,
5
no, no.
seconds.
No, there's no such thing as 5 seconds.
No, 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 5 seconds.
Go on.
5 seconds.
Does that mean you get
President
5 seconds
Putin,
too?
no Russian authority even formulated any idea of sanctions. The only thing which Putin said, protection of Russian internal market. This is legitimate right of Russian government. That's why don't misuse terms.
But Paula, I want to thank you, though, for reminding us that Yanukovych not only turned his back on an association agreement, but what they call this comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. Mike Halsell.
Thank you very much. Mike Halsell, Johns Hopkins University. I want to thank both our speakers for really interesting presentations. A few very quick points. Andranik, at the very beginning of your talk, you said that it's a malicious propaganda in the West that people in Russia don't recognize Ukraine as an independent state. And let me just remind you that at the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, President Putin made an aside to President George W. Bush, you know Ukraine's not a real country.
I exactly, by the way, Putin repeated, which is commonplace now. This is not несостоявшееся государство. Nobody hides that.
Okay,
I
fine.
wrote that in 1992, 93, 94, and in 2014.
Okay.
Your press is writing that it's not yet.
Okay,
Okay,
fine.
Okay.
So you
Which
agree?
is, don't remind us something which is banality.
Okay, he is the
note.
president, though. I mean, president of the country. Second thing, I agree with you about the language issue. I don't think that half the population are native Russian speakers. It's more like 20 to 25%. But I have to say, I was completely dismayed to read that yesterday the Rada revoked the law about the status of the Russian language.
Exactly.
That's a mistake, and I agree with you on this. You say there's no legitimate power in Kiev. I disagree. 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have disagreed. But considering what has happened in the last 3 weeks, I would only refer to you to a document that begins with "when in the course of human events." You know, elections that is not the sum total of democracy. People can abuse an electoral mandate, and what's gone on is more than adequate justification. Fourth, if the lives of Russians are at stake, I can't guarantee that the Black Sea Fleet could stay out, and then you compare that to Libya. Let me remind you, there was a UN resolution on Libya. On the other hand, within Europe, Russia, as a successor power to the Soviet Union, signed the OSCE Accords, Copenhagen and Paris in 1990, by which respect the borders and gives every state the right to choose its own system of government. There's a gigantic difference between Libya and Ukraine in this. And then finally, I'm going to editorialize and just say something which we haven't talked about, and I think is the fundamental problem. I think that President Putin, who has his own concept of managed democracy or sovereign democracy or whatever you want to call it, does not want to see a competing alternative model right next door in a Slavic country in Europe. And the fact is, what happened 2 days ago in demonstrations in Moscow, when the protesters started chanting Maidan, Maidan, I think he's right to be afraid.
Mr. Mircea. Need a mic.
Oh, I can.
No, go ahead.
But, you know, well, despite.
Oh, David Rifkin, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Rick.
Sorry, David.
It's all right. Despite being a lawyer, I've been quite tempted to get into a serious discussion of international law and the treaties and successions.
You're right.
Let me ask Mr. Migranyan a very kind of a pragmatic realpolitik question. I understand that you have formidable interests in Ukraine. I hope you also understand that there are enormous dangers in both extreme options. Classical Washington policy exercise, two bookends, bad policy options. The good one is in the middle. Letting Ukraine evolve into something tremendously anti-Russian, et cetera, is bad for you, whether or not you think it's realistic. Now, I mean, I hope you realize how dangerous.
Cutting out, unfortunately.
Well, I can
Something is happening to this microphone.
I hope Russia realizes, Russian leaders realize, the enormous danger of trying to go of an overly muscular policy, opting for partition, or perpetual instability, with Ukraine as an economic basket case. Because with all due respect, and I'm not saying it to be contentious, this ain't Georgia, this ain't Abkhazia, it's a much bigger country with serious military, and the costs and consequences of playing out those muscular options are very, very dangerous for Russia, purely from Russia's perspective. So at least I hope that Russia would seriously explore doing what Paula is suggesting and having some effort to stabilize the situation in a way that respects Russia's interests, works with the EU, works with the United States, and you have a fortune, frankly, to show somewhat of my own bias. You have a very tractable president of the United States who I think would be very happy to work with Russia in a way that accommodates his interest in Ukraine. So it is possible. But I'm curious, am I wrong in thinking of, from your perspective, the enormous dangers in trying those muscular options? And let me just close by saying I understand Ukraine is not homogeneous, but with respect, neither is Russia. You have huge problems in the Caucasus. You have huge problems in Tatarstan. So I don't know if partitions and divisions outside of a unique situation of Georgia are very much in your own long-term interests.
Andranik, no, you save these up. You're going to get your chance. Because we need some others. Did you have one?
Yeah, but this was a question.
I know, well, you,
Okay,
I
we'll
know,
put
you saved
together
it
all
up.
the
That's
questions.
right, yeah.
I'll wait.
Anton Fedyashin, American University. Two quick questions. First of all, if you look at the Financial Times and the Kiev Post for the 21st of November 2013, Putin is quoted as calling on the EU, Kiev, and Moscow to sit down and begin to discuss the future of Ukraine. The EU and the US refuse. Why is that? And is this a possible way forward now that we've gone through 3 months and so much tragedy has happened? And the second question, quickly, is how much of a division is there between the EU and the US going forward, given especially the phone call? Thank you.
We're going to take one or two other questions. They're taking notes. Mr. Ambassador. And then Steve Larrabee.
Well, first, thank you for doing this. This is very important. And my question to Paula. Paula, you worked for a different administration, but as still an insider. Can you just elaborate what are the options for the U.S.? Perhaps 2 days from now, there will be some kind of government if things will go as they look like. Will the U.S. recognize this government, or what are the options for the U.S. in this respect? Is there any financial package that the U.S. may be able to prepare in connection with the IMF, how that can work?
Steve, before you ask your question, I'm going to pull rank here. I'm going to let the German ambassador ask his question, and then we're going to have, we've collected some comments here, and then I'll come to you.
It's more a comment. Thank you very much for doing this. I think we are witnessing a great revolution, and revolutions come in stages. And we have seen now the end of phase one. Unfortunately, the bloodshed is over, and Paula described how the European foreign ministers negotiated or contributed to this. But I think what we all have to keep in mind is that revolutions are highly non-linear. And it's extremely important that we keep message control here and know what kind of expectations we raise with what we do with all the participants in Moscow, but also in Ukraine. And therefore, I think it's extremely important that we have a coordinated EU-US message here. And what could this message be? I think part of it is, let's not be triumphal. This is not a victory of the West over Russia, as we had earlier thought that Russia had won the game when Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement. So let's not be triumphal. Second, we have to make sure that this is not a zero-sum game. We share an interest with Russia to create a peaceful and stable situation here. How can we go forward? I think Ukraine is facing, and Paula, you said this, is facing a massive economic crisis and financial crisis. I would be very worried if our answer would be, how can we raise enough money just to solve a problem? The answer can only lie in, because nobody can afford Ukraine, neither Russians nor the West. Ukraine must, in the end, help itself and introduce reforms that can be very painful. Give you example, the local gas price, the currency valuation, the budget deficit. So Ukraine is facing a phase of austerity. Austerity will not be very popular. So it's extremely important that we don't create the impression that we, together, the West, can somehow solve Ukraine's problem simply by raising money. Ukraine has to reform, painful reforms, and that, of course, is very difficult because you don't have a strong government now. Third, we have to keep the country together. I think this was said earlier. And we cannot do with a band-aid, but we have to really, I think you used the term, Paula, we have to bring in real reforms, and we need the IMF for it. And as I said earlier, we have to have a coordinated, cohesive European and American response.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to let our two speakers catch up on those questions or comments they want to address, and then we'll move on to further contributions. Why don't you go first this time, Paul?
Yeah, sure. It will give me a chance to follow.
Several comments. First, let me start with Mike. By the way, as you went over certain points, and you mentioned the point about, you know, the recent parliamentary action, you gave a good example of where balance is important. And all of these opposition parties, it's absolutely essential as they go forward that they take into account everyone. So I think you underscore that point very graphically. I wouldn't condone that kind of action of, you know, cutting off, which I think you were pointing out, meaning you know, literally cutting off the Russian language. Let me make a second point here, because we've talked a lot about borders, independence, sovereignty. I saw Radek Sikorski, who was speaking on the weekend, And he also reminded, and I think quite well, because you gave a list, Mike, of a number of agreements. He mentioned the Budapest Declaration. If all of you remember the Budapest Declaration, that's when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and the US, UK, and Russia all signed an agreement that Ukraine's borders would be respected and that sovereignty would be maintained. So, you know, in this, there are certain specific lines drawn here that we need to remember and keep in mind. So I would like to say I don't see intervention in the cards, because one would hope that such agreements would be kept in mind. Couple last points. The gentleman here, you had mentioned about the overture earlier. You, in a way, underscore my point, which was, in my view, as I said, I was critical. We didn't have a strategic vision. When I go back to 2004, and at the time in the Bush administration, the Bush administration relied on the EU, Javier Solana, and President Kwasniewski. They were in front. The US was there, but by the way, there was a lot of engagement with Russia during that period, which I also think was significant. So I would make the point, you know, there were a number of iterations here where we weren't engaged, you know, in this process. In terms of, you know, how much division, I think you said, within the EU, is that what you said, or EU and the US? I would say the only area that I can think of really in recent time was over this question about sanctions and how does one deal with the atrocities on the ground? What are the most effective ways? But, you know, having said that, I think that was not a difference of what the bottom line is, but it was a difference of how you deal with your tactical arrangements in this. What comes first, how you do it in order to actually have a consequence and have impact. So actually, I think that there's been a very strong attempt at unity. And then lastly, the comment about, from the ambassador about the issue about options here, and even building on what the German ambassador has said, I would go first to the issue of the financial package. And by the way, I think you quite rightly say, it shouldn't be resting solely on the shoulders of the EU and also of the United States. Reforms need to be taken from within. And also, there have been a number of suggestions put forth, even by several people here in this audience, about the importance of involving the oligarchs. The oligarchs in Ukraine have been very vocal about the importance of stability and an association with the EU. And so they have an investment in this and can actually be very constructive by putting in some monies toward this end and actually helping in terms of a financial package. Politically, I think that this process needs to go forward. It was a diplomatic engagement. Interestingly enough, when you look at it, you know, the negotiations were with Yanukovych. And there were 6 elements that came out of this and then over to the parliament, and of which Yanukovych had agreed to initially. And so, you know, your question is, all right, what about us and what do we recognize? I think we need to be supportive, but I also don't think we're going to support actions that I think will have harmful effects for all concerned, including Ukraine. And in this sense, that's why I emphasize the critical element of unity. I think there needs to be active diplomacy, not sitting over here. And finally, I also think that on this, that the reforms, just going back to that, I need to emphasize that. That is so crucial, because if these changes don't come from with Ukraine, it's not going to be us, anyone waving a magic wand for it to happen.
Andranik.
I just love the choice of Dmitry to have Paula here as my partner. You know, I enjoy listening to what you are proposing, but unfortunately, you are skipping a couple of things. First, you said that there were expectations that Ukraine is going to fall apart. In this country, everywhere, it didn't happen. But I'm afraid that you just either ignored or didn't listen what I said, because you had 2 first very cautious, very sober as they called themselves, peasants. Kravchuk сам мне говорил, мы крестьяне. Peasants who were very cautious. They are coming from the east and appeasing west. But what happened? By the way, rocking the boat started Yushchenko, Timoshenko, and the west. You can't rock the boat and just ignore the east. Rocking, the crisis started at that time, Orange Revolution, first. Second, you told us that now this is the mood that they are cleaning them up. This was the main slogan of Orange Revolution, which ended up in total corruption, fighting each other, and absolutely chaos and mess, in which Ukrainian economy, politics, everything appeared. Which means, at this moment, absolutely I am agree with you, that there is a need for these people to unite themselves. But who can unite? Listen, right sector is going to unite with Yatsenyuk, or Timoshenko, or Svoboda Tsagnebok. They are fascists, anti-Semites. By the way, yesterday I was coming and reading Kiev rabbi applied to Israel and Avigdor Lieberman to take measures in order to protect Jews, and they openly, made a statement that Jews have to leave Kiev and leave to Ukraine because they are in danger. These guys are, listen, this right sector representative said, we are going to hang Timoshenko because she is Jewish. But though she was considered in Russia Armenian, in some other places something else. Nobody cares, but this is the mood. Which means when radicals are coming from the West, they are threatening the unity of the country. This is first thing. Second, about economic package. Great idea. If you are ready, who is going to pay? Europe doesn't have money. Greece was rescued. Of course, Germany has to pay. Are you ready to pay? Who else is going to pay? Even Steve Pfeiffer, former ambassador of Ukraine, wrote in one of his pieces that, yeah, America doesn't have money, but Europe has to pay to make irreversible the process of drifting Ukraine from Russia. I don't understand. This is, and these guys are telling us that they are not interfering in Russian-Ukrainian relations. They are friendly to Russia and they are respecting Russia. Great question was asked here. Russians said, listen, let's negotiate. We are ready to negotiate with EU and Ukraine. But this was turned down. You are now calling us that it's good thing to work together. You didn't want to work together. Might be Victoria Nuland was working with somebody, I don't know. We didn't work with her. And I think EU also didn't. And another important thing which I would like to say. Even Zbigniew Brzezinski, the old guy whom I respect very much, I don't agree with him on every issue, but even here, he felt as an old guy, a real guy who has some understanding, contrary to the people who appeared on Sunday shows, absolute, lunatics who were talking about the country, the problems, not having even slight idea what's going on over there. Zbig said, it's a good idea to Finlandize Ukraine. By the way, who was rocking the boat? He is returning now back to Declaration of Independence of Ukraine. What is written in Declaration of Independence? Ukraine is going to be neutral country, non-allied with anybody, anything, and all this. And who started rocking the boat? Who started pushing this country in this fragile situation? And anybody is going, and as once was written recently in Washington Post to this situation, somebody wrote that Putin has every opportunity to say, hypocrite, take plank out of your eyes before teaching us what to do and how to do. I am quoting the Bible.
Steve Larrabee and then Dimitri Simes.
Steve Larrabee ran. I'd like to go back to the issue of Ukraine possibly splitting, because I think actually this is a more realistic possibility than, Paula, you allude to. It's not inevitable by any manner of means, but it is true, and I think, and Andranik is right, there is a different mentality, a different history, a different cultural values in the East. And you can see already that the East is beginning to worry that what's happening, that somehow the West, you will have a Western government without representation. And the discussion of federalism is rather interesting because it began in the East, because they would like to have some sort of guarantee of their own choices. So I would say what really is crucial is how does this take place? Does it take place peacefully, the way it did in the Czechoslovakia, the way it did in Germany uniting? That's the issue under OSCE. Peaceful change, you might be able to do it. And I'm not so sure myself that that wouldn't be a better solution than having two insecure parts of the Ukraine with very different political histories, with very different cultural values, with very different economic problems. So I would just point that out. And the last point, just make, you also have the fact that everyone is sort of overjoyed with what is happening. But this is just the beginning. This is a long-term struggle. And
Exactly.
Andranik is right in this sense too. In 2004,
In every sense.
no, I wouldn't say that. 2004 and 2005, Ukraine managed, the political elite squandered a historic opportunity. And the danger is that now that Yanukovych is gone, that the protest movement itself will begin to fragment and will not be able to put forward the type of cohesive economic and political, or implement the type of coherent economic and political reforms that the IMF will demand in order to get the money.
You know, I didn't answer to very important question.
Yeah,
20
well,
seconds, if you give me
I'm
20
gonna
seconds, because
then
this is
you don't
his-
get to make a comment at the end.
Oh, I see. Okay,
All right.
because I didn't answer the most
No,
important
we'll
question.
get back to David's question, but Dimitri.
I actually was quite encouraged by this conversation because there was more common ground than I personally anticipated. First, about what Paula Dobriansky said. I think it's absolutely clear that most Ukrainians are interested in the Euro-Atlantic integration. Incidentally, let's just be clear that even in Crimea, 52% of all respondents were in favor of an agreement with the European Union. In other eastern Ukrainian areas like Kharkov, Lugansk, a percentage of people who are in favor of that direction is even higher. I also think that that's the reason Yanukovych wanted to go to Vilnius, and that's why he was making that profound commitment to move Ukraine in the European direction during his whole presidency. And incidentally, he made this commitment even before he ran for president. That's why there was such a sense of disappointment in Ukraine. I think Andranik is absolutely right, however, that Russian response was much more restrained than it appeared to many observers here. And the reason for that is that, in my view, we're confusing two different things. A clear element of Russian imperial nostalgia, and I have to say that, well, as Graham Greene used to write, most of us are nostalgic about something. You know, it's not inherently wrong to be nostalgic about your imperial glory, as long as it doesn't translate into your practical policy. And I have to say that, in my view, Russian practical policy, not statements of some responsible Russian parliament deputies, but Russian state policy was fairly restrained. I don't see any evidence that Russia wants to interfere in Ukraine. As Paula said, I don't see any evidence that anybody in Ukraine, including in Crimea, is inviting Russia to interfere in Ukraine. Having said that, let me say where I totally agree with Andranik, and actually, particularly with the German ambassador. A lot depends upon how we treat this situation. Do we know when to stop? Do we know how to constrain some of our allies and proteges in Ukraine? I remember vividly how in 2007, 2008, when we were discussing the cause of independence, some of us were telling the State Department, in the White House, in your administration, that look, if you move in that direction, and particularly if you move in that direction full speed without any coordination with Russia, there is going to be a war over Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Russia would be bound to prevail. Some people did not like to hear that, because this was unpleasant news. No matter, it was true. I think that if we are not careful, if some Ukrainian radicals go to Crimea, try to attack the Black Sea Fleet, which is Russian Guantanamo, you may discover a situation when whatever are Putin's cautious inclinations, that at the end they would be overwhelmed by Russian imperial pride and by Russian public opinion. So I am with you, Paula, in terms of the overall direction of Ukraine, but I am with Andranik in terms of understanding that they are still dangers, and we have to be aware of them in order to lose victory, which is so close.
All right, now in order to give both our speakers a brief moment for making concluding remarks, I'm going to just call on two other questions or comments. One is from Ambassador Simoni and Matt Rojansky.
Hi. Johns Hopkins University Center for Transatlantic Relations, but I'm Hungarian, and we kind of worry about. I'm the former ambassador of Hungary to the United States, and I am the former Hungarian ambassador to NATO as well.
That's enough of an introduction.
Yes. And okay, if you want me to go further, yes, and I remember 1956. So I just want to say, I want to follow up on some of the comments, particularly Mike and Steve Larrabee. I would say that well, first of all, we're in it for the long haul. We should not forget that. This is not going to be over soon, anytime soon. I do worry that we have to see the big picture seen from the Russian point of view. I think Ukraine is really not just about Ukraine, as we know. It really is what hangs in the balance is really the future of the system, the style of governance that Putin has basically redeveloped, reinvented, and I think if, in this respect, if Ukraine falls, not physically, but if Ukraine falls as a follower of that model, then I think the Russians, I think Putin is getting worried. Please understand that we in Eastern Europe do feel the cold, whether you like it or not, the cold coming from the East all the time. And I just want to remind you about that. What happens in the Ukraine is very much very important to the further development of the eastern flank of the EU and the alliance. I'd also like to say that I think money is very, very important. I think it's very important that Europe and the United States, the West as such, is not smallish in the way it supports the Ukraine financially. And while I do agree that it has to go hand in hand with reforms, requirements, this and that, please don't leave it to the bureaucrats to negotiate, because there is a big picture. And I do hope, in the discussion I was not sure I detected from all of you, there is more in the balance than it is seen. And finally, I'd like to say that I do believe that the Russians do have a strategy on the West, and I think they do have a strategy on how to push back on the form of democracy that we believe in. And I think this is an underlying element in how they are going to be looking at and how they will be treating the Ukraine. Thanks.
Last question, Matt.
By the way, may I just say one thing? Matt is one of the people who put forth this idea about getting the oligarchs, by the way, to step forward in Ukraine to put money on the table. Sorry, Matt.
Expropriacja,
Yes,
expropriatorов,
all of them, including Yanukovych's son.
We remember Marx and Lenin, expropriacja, expropriatorov. They
thank you guys.
stole the money, they have to pay back.
You're using up your time.
So it seems Dmitry, of course, is right about the numbers across Ukraine, east, south, center, and west. The majority has consistently supported EU integration. On the one hand, that's a divisive issue because, from a Russian perspective, that's joining a geopolitical bloc. I think we just have to be realistic about that. So that may not be seen from Moscow as being in its interest. At the other end of the spectrum, I know from Moscow's perspective, it is not in Moscow's interest to see Ukraine disintegrate into civil war or division of the country. The crux of all of this lies in a domestic political question which will have something to do with the oligarchs, Paula, and that's engagement of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, whether it's 10 million people, 15 million people, 20 million people, however you want to define it. If in the short-term and middle-term future, Russian-speaking Ukrainians are left out of Ukraine's political future, that's the one thing that will change that equation. Those people will see the geopolitical path toward EU integration as being against them, versus if they're not left out of the process, they'll vote their consciences as they have done in the statistics that Dmitry cited. I think that may be the one area where there's a real overlap between the interests of Moscow and Washington and Brussels, which is, even though there is a geopolitical balance out in the distance, I don't think anybody wants to see a scenario where the next few steps in Ukraine's political development leaves a huge chunk of Ukraine out, which raises the question I've recommended. That means the oligarchs need to step up, because all the legitimate representatives, the sort of previously elected representatives of Russian-speaking southern and eastern Ukraine, have essentially fled or been discredited. I mean, they really lack a meaningful, at this point, civil society, democratic representation. So the question for our foreign policy is, what tools do we have to ensure that they do take part in the process of forming this new Ukrainian government, that they are not left out, that some of the mistakes of 2005 and 2006 are not repeated? And do we have the political will to use those tools?
All right, we're coming to the end here. I'm going to call on Andranik, but I'm going to do it in the form of asking him a question. In the Orange Revolution, it was very commonly said that one of Putin's principal concerns was the likelihood that somehow this process would spread into the Russian Federation. You're hearing some similar comments in the West today to describe Russian thinking and Russian concerns. Is there any real worry in Moscow of another falling domino here?
I really would like to answer to this question, because in different ways this was raised, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I have a fantastic answer to this, because I commented that endlessly, wrote enormously.
I thought you would.
If something happened about which Putin couldn't even dream, that was Orange Revolution and discreditation of Orange Revolution, total discreditation. Russian people just disgusted what happened in Ukraine after Orange Revolution, because it really created such expectations, cleaning up, fresh air, fighting of corruption, democracy, all ended up in dirt, ugliness, and disgusting things which happened after that. Total corruption. Second, Putin doesn't care. Putin is happy in this sense that it could stimulate something in Russia. Quite contrary. Russian public opinion is totally behind him on this issue. Russian liberals, radical liberals, even if they had something to say, they are just absolutely much more marginalized, because after Victoria Nuland's gift and some others, after Russians meddling, American meddling, EU meddling, all this, all these inefficient actions all this miserable money offer and all these stupid things. Putin is afraid. Putin pardoned Khodorkovsky from the position of strength. He is pardoning everybody because Russia overcame all that syndrome long ago. And now Ukrainian situation is helping him strongly consolidate the situation, consolidate the public opinion, and get even more support. And Sochi Olympic even made him triumphant because Western media, as I published in my article recently, helped him enormously, predicting total failure, and it was total victory and triumph. And in Ukraine, another important thing which I would like to say, who is controlling the situation? Paula, I agree with you that it's good to have unified opposition. You think Klitschko or Yatsenyuk, they are commanding the parade over there? No. Right sector, radicals and extreme nationalists are commanding over there. And they are now, by the way, taking positions in law enforcement agencies. They are taking legitimate power to use the force. They are radicals, and first decisions, they are showing what's going to happen in Ukraine and what you can expect. And I absolutely agree. This is the first phase. Yesterday when I was talking to Moscow, some people told me from there that, you know, this is in Ukraine, February revolution, ahead is October. And coming back to the last question, and coming back to the question, you know, I think I emphasized that Moscow always was very cautious. Everybody in Moscow knows that Ukraine, it's a huge country. It's very hard to burden Ukraine whole. It's impossible to do any adventurism over there. You must be very, very cautious. Everybody knows that. But I remember the guy whom once I met in China, General Haig, who once famously said, at that time I was in Moscow on KGB blacklist, not having a possibility to travel. I read and said, oh, this guy is a great guy. He said, there are something more important than peace. You know, if you are pushing Moscow against the corner and Putin against the corner, if you are going to create bloodshed, civil, war and clashes, you can't expect that country next door who is interested in having stability and order on its borders and inside its own country to stay away. This is the reality, which means nobody in Moscow is going to interfere. Don't push and don't force Moscow to interfere. This is the reality. But there are cases, as I said, when General Haig famously formulated.
At this sentence, General Haig is a real authority.
Last word, Paula.
Right, I have just 3 points. First, Dmitry, I agree with what you said on both Ukraine, which you were agreeing with me, but by the way, I agree with what you said, and then in turn, in this case, with Andranik. I would not endorse radicals in Ukraine. We're going into Sevastopol. Ukraine has leased out, as we know, and Yanukovych extended it to 2045. It should be kept.
42.
45.
42.
Anyhow, bottom line is it should be definitively maintained. And that goes to the point that Matt made. I mean, he's talking about Russian speakers. This is another very important issue for Russia. During this very sensitive time, of course you wouldn't want to see something like that take place. So I'm in agreement. And Matt, absolutely. You gave a graphic example. I tried to make a broader point that in going forward, this is going to be a very delicate situation, and one in which I think those in Ukraine are going to need some guidance, some help, some assistance. And that's what we should be looking for, the balance here, absolutely. And I said that you know, for the government in this transitional period, you have to have the East, the West, the Middle, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, etc. And finally, the last thing I'll put forward, and this might come as a surprise to some people around the table, but you know what? Andranik convinced me in one thing. He mentioned Putin is very secure. I agree. I think that Putin is very secure.
Absolutely secure. Never ever he was more secure than he now.
We got that.
I agree with this point. And you know what? I don't think then, I think he should be and would be open-minded to the evolution of change in Ukraine. It depends on how that change is unfolded. A democratic model should not be a threat. There are democracies around Russia in varying degrees in the neighborhood, I'll use it broadly. So quite frankly, I will end on this upbeat note. Taking what he just said, I actually see an opportunity for good and thoughtful diplomatic engagement, which can really make a substantial change in Ukraine that will benefit not just Ukraine, but actually the entire neighborhood, and in that democratic path.
Thank you, Paula.
You always can do something positive from position of strength rather than from position of weakness.
I apologize for running over, but it was too good.